Welcome to the sensor. What is the sensor and what is it for? We are going to look at the sensor in the camera and how it works. Then John is going to teach you about ISO range from 100 to 1600. We're going to explore grain and noise in our images and see how far we can push our cameras in low light.
The sensor is the heart and soul of the modern camera, so let's take a closer look at it. First thing that we want to talk about is the sensor size, because that's what the camera is built around. And if you've been out on the market looking for new cameras, you'll notice that sensor size is one of the most important things because there's a lot of different options available out there. In general, the larger the sensor, the better image that you're going to get because you have more light coming in. But it has an effect on the size of the camera and the types of lenses and the other accessories that you use with it. Now, the easiest way to describe these is to start with the largest of these, which is based off of 35mm film. Now, 35mm film was the most popular type of film for about 50 to 60 years, and it was this Goldilocks medium of small enough that we could put it into a camera and hang it around our neck and trot around Europe for weeks on end, but it was big enough that we could produce a real nice poster-size image from it. And that has carried forward with the digital sensor. But digital sensors are very expensive, and so a lot of manufacturers, especially in the early days of digital, made smaller size sensors so they can make more affordable cameras and smaller cameras. And to this day, there are many different camera sizes with many different size sensors in them to meet different people's needs. As I say, the largest of these, as far as the common ones, is known as the full frame sensor, 36 by 24 millimeters in size. And this is something that's going to be used on a lot of the top-end professional cameras. Now, I've always found the names that they use a little confusing, and one of the ways that I like to think about things is just by measuring these from corner to corner so that we can see that this has a 43 millimeter size from corner to corner, and we can see how much larger it is than the popular crop frame cameras, which are either 28 or 27 millimeters in size. Now, with portrait photography, detail is usually pretty important, and so photographers tend to want to go towards the higher quality cameras. And so full frame or crop frame is probably where most people are going to want to go for high quality portrait images. Now, you can shoot portraits on the smaller size sensors, but there's going to be limitations in the number of pixels that you can get, how will they work under low light, and in other various conditions. And so for most portrait photographers, I'm recommending full frame or the crop frame sensor in a camera. So let's take a closer look at these cameras here. And so if you do want to get into these, this is where most of the brands are making their cameras. As you can see, we have a lot of different camera companies making full frame cameras these days. Now, these are known to have a crop factor of 1.0, and that is because they're the same size as 35mm film. And 35mm film has such a strong history. It's how we draw connections and align a lot of things, and so it's very important to know that standard. Now, the smaller size sensors will have a crop to them, a crop factor. In this case, it's 1.5 with the 28mm sensor, and for how that is figured out, it's basically its relationship to the larger size sensor. What happens when you put on that smaller size sensor is that your images are cropped in by a factor of 1.5, and your lenses look like they're a more telephoto version of themselves by a factor of 1.5. Canon has chosen to go with 1.6. It's nearly the same, and we can kind of combine them together in our comparisons. What does this mean when you're out taking photos? Well, let's take an example. We've got a full frame sensor here, and let's go ahead and capture an image with it using our full frame camera. What happens if we were to shoot this with a crop frame camera? Well, we're going to have a smaller sensor in the camera, so we're going to be capturing a cropped version of that full frame camera. Our subjects are going to look the same, the background's going to look the same, but it is a crop size, and that may force us to move forward or backward or choose a different lens, and so there's going to be a different set of standards when you have one of these crop frame cameras. And so it's going to be a little different lens that you use if you wanted to get the same shot, and as I say, you're going to have to adjust where you're standing. So in this particular image, I was using a full frame camera and a 50mm lens to get this shot. If I wanted to take the same image with a cropped frame camera, I could. I would need a different lens. In this case, I would need a 35 millimeter lens. Why do I need a 35? Well, when you have a different size sensor, you're going to need a different lens to match up with it, and you can use the crop factor to figure out which lens you need. If you have a 35 millimeter lens and it's got a crop factor of 1.5, well, that's about equal to a 50 millimeter lens. And so as you learn more information about photography, one of the terms you'll hear is equivalency a lot. This lens is equivalent to this lens, and they're often referring that to angle of view. This 35 millimeter lens on a crop frame body is equivalent to a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame body, and you can get a very similar shot with either one. So the main thing to know is that larger will get you a better quality image. It will cost you more. It will cause your camera to be a little bit larger and all the lenses to be larger as well. So there is a bit of a trade-off, and each person will need to decide for themselves as to what they're doing with the photograph and what their budget will allow as to what is best for them. The next aspect I want to talk about is ISO in reference to the image sensor. The ISO refers to the sensitivity of the sensor, and it comes from this international standards organization that has set the sensitivity of these so that it's roughly the same from one brand to the next. And so if you were to set shutter speeds and apertures and ISOs on a Canon and a Nikon and a Sony, you would get roughly the same exposure in all cases. Now, the way most cameras have this set up is that 100, in most cases, not all, is the base or native sensitivity of the sensor. And that means that it's designed to record the best quality image when set to this particular ISO setting. Now, you can crank it up, you can turn it up, you might say, and make it more sensitive so it can record under lower light conditions. There will be effects from this that I will show you in just a moment. So you could take it up to 200 or 400 and on and on and on. And many cameras will go well beyond this, but it's not a place that most photographers need to go on any sort of regular basis. And so if you are recording under low light conditions, if you are needing faster shutter speeds, you can crank the sensitivity of the sensor up. But as I say, there are implications of doing that. So you generally want to set the ISO as low as you can to get the optimum image quality. You'll set it up to a higher one in order to get higher sensitivity. Now, when you go from a setting of, say, 800 to 1600, you've doubled the number. You've also doubled the sensitivity. So this is a linear scale, very much like shutter speeds. If you want to have twice as much, you just change it a full stop to the next setting. And that's how we use those terms, a full stop once again. Now, if we go from 800 down to 400, it's half the number, and so it's half the sensitivity, and it would be twice as dark in this case. Now, a lot of cameras, but not all of them, will allow you to set in third stops, so you can be very, very accurate with these in-between settings. And so, as I say, it's not on all cameras, but on many cameras, if you wanted to be very precise, you could set it there. Now, some cameras will give you kind of a word or a letter like L1 or low 1 or high 1 or H1. And these refer to extra high settings or extra low settings beyond the normal capabilities of the sensor on the camera. A lot of times these are achieved by software after the fact. And there tends to be a bit more of a penalty in the quality of the image when you set this. So it's something that you would generally try to avoid, but is only there for emergency reasons. Now, one of the other options that we have with ISO is setting an automatic setting. And so this is where the camera will automatically select what ISO it thinks you need. And I always wondered, well, how does it know what ISO I need? Well, the fact of the matter is that the camera looks at your shutter speed, tries to give you a reasonable shutter speed for whatever it thinks you might be doing, and then it sets the ISO appropriately. And if you want to take control of your photography, you're going to need to take control of your ISO. You cannot leave it on auto ISO here. This is a bit, I think the analogy that works best is it's kind of like automatic drive in a car. And that's fine for simple everyday driving, but if you're driving a race, you're going to have very particular needs as to what gear you want to be in. And so for the portrait photographer, I recommend setting this manually, and I'm going to continue to go through the steps as to how to set it manually. Generally, you're going to start low and you'll go up as necessary. So what happens if you set it very high? Well, I want to show you what the noise looks like when you do set your camera to a very high setting. Now, as you can see, everything on the top row is going to look very clean. But if we go ahead and just look at the worst of these, when the ISO is set all the way up at 102,400, you can see it doesn't look real clean. It kind of looks like the old days of film and graininess. And this is the noise. What's happening here is the sensor is not receiving very much light. It's amplifying what light it has, and it doesn't have a lot of clean information. And so it doesn't give you a very clean image. And so you want to try to keep your camera as low as possible. I tend to try to shoot at ISO 100 in my camera as much as I can. The fact of the matter is that 200 and 400 and 800 are still very clean, and as newer cameras come out, the better they get, the cleaner it is at these higher ISOs. But it's always better lower than it is high, with the only exception if your camera has a low setting. So you want to figure out what the native sensitivity of your sensor is and be aware of what that number is, because that's where you're going to want to shoot a lot of photos. So the range that you would typically use is going to be from 100 to maybe 6400. And so for your best quality portraits, you're going to want to try to set it to ISO 100. The thing that's great about ISO 100 is that you can crop in, zoom in, and you're going to have really clean information all the way into very small details. And that's what you get when you shoot with a low ISO. Now, if I need a little bit faster shutter speed, I may need to bump the ISO up. And this is the reason why you move ISO up in most cases, is that you need a little faster shutter speed. And if you have a faster shutter speed, you're letting in less light. And when you set a higher ISO, you're letting the sensor amplify that light a little bit and compensate for that faster shutter speed. And so if your subject's moving around a little bit, you're still going to be able to get very clean information. Now, I wanted to crop in and zoom and show you this, and I wanted to show you the earring in this particular case because it's kind of blurry. We've shot with some fairly shallow depth of field, and if the earring was really important in this picture, I would have had to adjust my aperture, and I would probably have to shoot with a higher ISO, which I will show you here in just a moment. So shooting at ISO 400, it's still pretty clean on all modern cameras, and so you can still crop in and get very clean. Not as clean as 100, but it's still very good. And in this case, now I can see the earring a little bit more clearly because I've stopped my aperture down to get a little bit more depth of field. By stopping the aperture down, I let in less light, and I've had to compensate by bringing my ISO up to a little bit higher level of ISO 400. And so I don't have a problem shooting portraits 100 through 800. It's whatever is necessary to make sure it's sharp and clear and as detailed as I want to see. In this particular case, the model was wearing this headscarf that had a lot of detail to it, and I wanted to make sure that you could see that detail. So I chose a little bit more depth of field and went up to ISO 800 in order to do that. And with a modern full-frame camera, which is what I was using for this photograph here, I am still getting very clean information even when we zoom in very, very closely. I prefer not getting up to the 1600 and 3200 range, but I will absolutely go there if necessary. If my subject's moving around and I'm needing a faster shutter speed to stop their movement, then of course I will use that higher ISO if necessary. And when you zoom in here, you'll start to see that it's not quite as smooth and as clean as those lower ISOs, but with modern cameras, it is still quite good and quite acceptable for most types of photography. Generally speaking, 3200 is the highest that I will go with the modern full-frame camera. In here, if I'm needing a faster shutter speed or if it's lower light levels, I can still get very clean information and very detailed information. But once you get in really close, you're going to start to notice that the information, if you look at the whites of her eyes, for instance, and her skin, it's not as smooth as it is in the lower ISOs. And so I would try to avoid these higher ISOs if you can. Sometimes you may need to move your subject to a brighter area. You might need to get more lights. You might need to get a faster lens. There's a lot of different options that will enable you to shoot at a lower ISO. So looking back on our list of ISOs, you want to try to keep it as low as possible. For most people in most cameras, that's going to be 100. And then you will crank it up as necessary, and generally speaking, you're going to raise ISO for one of two reasons. One is you need a little bit faster shutter speed. You need to compensate with the ISO. And in some cases, you might need more depth of field. If you have clothing or fabric that you're trying to show more detail in not quite such a narrow band of focus, you may need to close the aperture down, which means less light, which means you can compensate with a higher ISO. And so there is definitely a balance between ISO and shutter speed. And I shot this series of photographs to show you that there is a balance of what's best, because I've mentioned before that quite a bit in this section that the lower ISO setting is better. But if your subject is moving and it's blurry, then it's not better. And so in this case, I had the camera on a tripod and I had my subject sitting down trying to stay as still as possible. When I choose an ISO of 100, she's moving around because it's a very slow shutter speed of a half a second, and I'm getting blurriness in the photograph. And the same thing with the quarter second. And the best balance between the shutter speed and the ISO is probably coming at either 400 or 800 ISO, which is at an 1/8 or a 15th of a second. Now, normally these are much slower shutter speeds than I would recommend, but she's a professional model and she was sitting down being very still, and so she was extremely good at being stationary. The concept is that there is a balance between where you have your ISO set and where you have your shutter speed. And you need to make sure that your subject is sharp. It doesn't matter how low your ISO is at that point. So the first priority is make sure you have a shutter speed fast enough to stop your hand holding of the camera and your subject's motion if they're standing or sitting or doing whatever they're doing. And then you will move the ISO to accommodate the shutter speed that you need.
What I'm going to do now is show you how I'm using the light meter in my camera and how sometimes when you are photographing dark backgrounds and dark clothing, you can override the sensor. So it's getting a little confused. Right now, as you can see, I have mounted onto a tripod just so that I've got a nice solid base to show you. I have focused on Kathleen's eye. I'm just going to get her chin in the perfect position. That's exactly right. Now, when I take a focus on her eye, when I take a light meter reading in camera, I'm at 2.8, an aperture of 2.8 at an ISO of 400 in natural light. And it's telling me a perfect exposure would be 60th of a second. Now, I'm going to shoot this at the exact exposure and shutter speed and setting that my light meter is telling me. So I just wait for a blink. I take my shot. Absolutely beautiful. But I notice that the hair, the highlights, and the skin are a little overexposed. So even though it was telling me that was the perfect setting, what it's doing is it's seeing all the black in the background, it's reading all the black in her dress, and it's saying, oops, there's a lot of dark in this image, I need more light. So it's actually shooting about a stop overexposed than where I would like it. I'm going to override my own light meter, and if you watch here on the back of the camera, I'm actually going to speed up the shutter to 1.25, which is the perfect shutter speed for a portrait. I'm at aperture 2.8, focusing on her eye because I love shallow depth of field. Now, when I take a reading, it says it's a whole stop underexposed, but I'm allowing for the fact that there is a lot of dark in this image in the background in her dress, and it's going to give me the perfect exposure. So this is when I override my sensor. It is not normally wrong, it's always very close, but we're just pushing it that little bit further. Now I'm going to do the exact opposite. I'm going to put Kathleen in a white dress on a white background. My sensor is going to read all the light and tell me I need a lower exposure, and I'm going to push it one stop overexposed. This is when I learn to trust my eye and my camera. I know that if I want to move that needle by a stop, I'm going to look at the back of the camera, gauge how much dark is there, and say, no, I'm going to drop down, underexpose, one full stop. And then I'm going to do the opposite. Let's flip to the white set and see how it responds with all the white light. Now we're on the white set, we're going to do the exact same thing in the reverse. I've set up my camera so I have an anchor point for you. I'm at 1000 ISO because it's fairly low light in here today. I'm at an aperture of f2.8. When I focus on her face, you can see, even though I've got these big white reflectors sending light back to her, the light source is behind her and the sensor is getting confused. The sensor is reading all of the light in there and it's saying, oh, but we need more. Now, if I just keep upping my ISO, it doesn't change the fact that I am getting a better reading, but what I'm doing is also pumping up my ISO, which is bringing in more grain, and I don't actually need to do that. There is a little trick, and that is the exact opposite that I did to the dark background. Get your exposure and take your shot. Because of all the white, the outfit and the background, you're going to be a perfect light meter reading in camera, but obviously this image is very underexposed. So I'm going to manually override that meter by actually slowing down the shutter to give myself more light into the image without increasing the ISO. I'm not concerned because the shutter is still at 1000, which is nice and fast. And as you can see on the back of the camera here, I am almost 2 full stops overexposed what the light meter was telling me, but I can see on the back of my camera that I have the perfect exposure that I need. So I can push down 1 to 2 stops, or I can push up 1 to 2 stops when I want a black background and a white background to get the perfect exposure. Let me take this shot. Beautiful. And as you can see, I have this gorgeous backlit natural light image that is perfectly exposed. Right, I'm going to focus on Kathleen. She looks absolutely gorgeous. It's telling me to shoot at this aperture in this light with this ISO. We're currently at, we'll go to 1000 ISO and nice shutter. It's saying a perfect meter reading in camera here. We'll take that photo. Clearly you can see it's very underexposed. I'm going to slow down my shutter speed to increase the amount of light coming into this image by almost 2 stops. I'm still at 250th of a second at aperture of 2.8, and when I click this image here, there you go, you can see that even though I have manually overridden the shutter speed, manually overridden the internal light meter, this is the exact look that I want.